Before we continue, understand this podcast is for adults only and refers to relationships and activities between adults which are voluntary and consensual. If you or anyone you know is being abused, coerced, or violently aggressed against, please reach out for help to the appropriate authorities. Hello and welcome. Gorean Voice, Episode 17, Gore and Honor. It's great to be back in the studio, and I hope you all had a great summer. Welcome to Season 2. On this happy Sunday morning, I'm going to discuss the H word, honor. The word comes up in discussions about Gore quite often. What does it even mean? One side of the definition places honor as something of a synonym for integrity, consistency, courage, and honesty. I happen to like this side of the definition. The other side of it has a personal or group history aspect. It's something like one's reputation or one's pride. I'm a little less enthusiastic about this side of the word, but I can be comfortable spending time there as well. You see, I grew up in the English-speaking, individual liberty-minded West. However, I had opportunities at various points in my teens and 20s to visit and live and work in areas where tribal societies are the norm. While the word honor is not always specifically used internally, all of these societies could be described as honor cultures from the outside. So what is an honor culture? I'd like to give two contrasting examples. Once, I was in an older part of the world, and I needed to find a few specific people for work purposes. My local source said we had to take a several-hour detour to avoid a certain town and its surrounding countryside. Why? Was it dangerous? At the time, the whole country was dangerous. We had to avoid that specific part because of some bad blood between my guide and the locals. Someone's uncle had slain someone's cousin some years ago. I asked him how long ago this had happened, and he said it had been several centuries. So, in an honor culture, where people can at most read one book and nobody can write, everybody remembers who killed who from hundreds of years ago. Now let's have a look at the opposite. Every June, there is a gathering called the Hatfield and McCoy Reunion Festival for a 3-day weekend. If you're not familiar with those names, they are the names of two prominent American families in Virginia and Kentucky who famously feuded with each other during the latter half of the 19th century. There were somewhere between 32 and 100 deaths attributable to the feud, though some of it took place during the American Civil War, hence the large error bars. Their descendants have managed to put any blood feuding behind them and today collaborate on such cultural projects as the joint festival mentioned above. What is it that has allowed these men to transcend their southern honor culture and live as modern, peaceful neighbors? I don't know. But there are 5 main facets that I've identified in honor cultures which needed to be transcended or mutated or switched off entirely. So one of them is emphasis on reputation. Obviously, emphasis on reputation is still operant, even in modern societies. Elsewise, there would be no such thing as a credit score. Still, honor culture's emphasis on reputation can in some cases transmute from a man's reputation for violence, the exertion of power, or even some gaudy, ostentatious, big chief, big cheese, large S, to a more philosophical-based reputation for forbearance, worldly wisdom, and consideration of the future. Somewhere along the way, the Hatfields and the McCoys both judged that having a global reputation for mending fences was more valuable to them than having a local reputation for vicious reprisals. 2. Responses to insults. In honor cultures, an insult is a prelude to violence. In modern cultures, it is likely only a dissolution of a potential transaction. Certain segments of modern societies, however, particularly in criminal subcultures, still adhere to the insult precedes violence lifestyle, to the point that certain words are essentially magical. Don't believe me? The next time you're in touch with someone in the English-speaking world who has spent time behind bars, ask him if he minds being called a goof. With respect to being called names, while it doesn't fill me with joy to have insults bounced off of my eardrums, I live in a major metropolitan area with thousands of unhoused, mentally ill people. If I responded to every case of verbal diarrhea as if some gauntlet had been thrown down, I'd have been involved in rather more violence than I'd like to be. For my own part, when it comes to barbs, I'll happily trade them with friends, but the worst I've said to an enemy was telling him I found him to be ungentlemanly. Perhaps, despite my own discomfort with honor cultures, some repressed part of me longs for bygone moments when saying, "Good day, sir," in italics, was as harsh a call-out as could be imagined. Number 3, family and group loyalty. Honor is not just personal, but also communal. The honor of a family, clan, or group is often seen as interconnected, and members are expected to protect and uphold each other's honor. Dishonoring oneself can bring shame to the entire group. This is one aspect of honor culture that I have a particularly difficult time with, especially with respect to the relationship between individuals of different ages. Honor cultures almost universally revere the elder generation, regardless of whether those people have earned such reverence. I happen to think this is a cultural scourge that permeates not only honor cultures, but nearly every culture that exists on this planet, from itinerant tribal cultures to cosmopolitan technological ones. I fear moral instruction of one's children is essentially impossible as long as this particular moral blind spot remains operant. I do not enjoin my children to respect me, or even to love me. I instruct them to love the people who demonstrate love to them, and respect people who are respectable. Of course, if I wish to reside in those categories in their lives, I must love them unreservedly and behave at all times respectably. A tall order, perhaps, but I encourage people to have voluntary relationships, my future adult children included. Will I be kicked out of their lives when they turn 18? Or will I die surrounded by loving grandchildren who helped take care of me up until my last breath? I don't know, but I want to deserve what I get. As such, I refuse to pay respect to places and people where it hasn't been earned. This has created tension at times with my family of origin, though every argument I've ever heard against it, either academically or from a close relation, seems to be hiding a rather plainly guilty conscience. Elders who say that all elders should be respected regardless of their conduct have likely not conducted themselves respectably. Those who have needn't say a word. I believe that raising children to earn respect and give respect where it has been earned is far and above preferable to the status quo, and I also think that any fealty to the status quo is positively counterproductive in this enterprise. The world is not big enough for both earned respect and unearned respect. I feel the same way about voluntary relationships in general. A society of peaceful, enlightened people, interacting on a voluntary basis, simply cannot share space with systems of coercion, be they slaves in the Athens where Socrates rambled, or a marginal tax rate over 50% in a society where we attempt to instruct children not to take what is not theirs. Well, number 4, gender roles. Honor cultures get a bit of a bad rap these days for their approach to gender roles. I live in an English-speaking Western country which takes immigrants from all over the world. When a woman from one of the more tribal backgrounds goes missing, I could make money all day long betting it was the husband or his family. This particular flavor of violence is bound up in the family honor issue under point number 3, and it tends to fall disproportionately on the females. Same goes for the Muslim girls when they are murdered by their family for acting or dressing immodestly. It only takes about 5 minutes before an old man with a beard reassures an interviewer that this has nothing to do with Islam. What a relief that is. These killings are frequently referred to as so-called honor killings, in scare quotes, as authors using such a term perhaps seek to separate the perverse honor that animates such violence from the genuine honors that are presented at jubilant award celebrations, somber military ceremonies, and other occasions such as graduations. Are these two species of honor different? Perhaps one of them needs to be called by some other name. Foolish pride? Brittle egos? I dislike the English use of the same word for both ideas. But what if they really are the same idea? On another note, while I dislike agreeing with feminists, they are some of the first to point out that the rigid gender roles found in honor cultures do harm to the men there as well. Being born a woman in Bangladesh may seem like a raw deal, but I wonder what it is like to be a gay man in Bangladesh. I should point out that while persecution of homosexual activity is quite common in honor cultures, it was not always universal, and many of these cultures have taken a much harder line against homosexuality in the last century than they had in the previous millennium. In many old world cultures, there have been specific places in social, economic, and spiritual life carved out for men who aren't attracted to women. A youth we would today call gay, in 15th century Florence, may have been pushed into the priesthood without too much concern for his personal desires, but it contrasts favorably with the push that a gay youth would receive today in the parts of the Near East that seem to have a one-book maximum: the long drop and a quick stop. Trials and tribulations of gay men aside, to say nothing of the Sapphic faction, women in honor cultures seem to bear the brunt of the consequences of honor infractions outside of all-out armed conflict. I must say that a few words in these honor cultures' favor, however, which applies whether or not you have a Gorean point of view. They are willing to say things about the sexes that most Westerners have either forgotten to say, or more likely, have shrunk from saying. There are differences in what constitutes a full life, a fulfilled life, and a good life between men and women. A modern, supposedly liberated woman may seem to have a much better life than a lass born to a tribal honor culture somewhere in the Himalayas. However, in the day-to-day life of what really matters, things like lowercase FaceTime, nursing an infant, or letting loving grandchildren fall asleep on one's shoulder, or embracing one's husband in the dark, the modern girl seems to be only ahead in terms of the number of TPS reports she has filed. Now, number 5, conflict resolution. This is where it counts. In honor cultures, conflicts are often resolved through displays of strength or courage, rather than legal or institutional means. This can sometimes lead to cycles of retaliation and violence. Unfortunately, the courage is rarely the spiritual or intellectual courage of a Jesus Christ, Confucius, or Galileo. Instead, it is expressed in the universal language of violence. This imposes a tremendous cost in terms of developing a high-trust society and makes economic scaling quite difficult. Consider the effects of oil wealth where it exists in tribal areas compared to the economic engines it powers in open societies. In the West, anti-oil activists might occasionally indulge in violent or destructive protests, whereas in tribal societies cursed with oil wealth, family lineage can mean the difference between living like an emperor and dying in the gutter. The 2007 film There Will Be Blood shows a little about how conflicts around resources used to be resolved in the West, and still are resolved to a great extent in the rest of the world. There are upsides to the tribal approach, which the West has lost since we gave up dueling and other violent means of settling arguments. For one thing, there are plenty of conflicts that don't rise to the level of legal intervention, yet reside above most people's threshold for tolerance of differing opinions on a given matter. Leaving so many of these small, but significant and meaningful conflicts up in the air isn't helping anybody's mental health. Many Western legal doctrines leave some room beside their definitions of assault for provocation, quote, fighting words, and most importantly, mutual combat. But these provisions are increasingly rare in law or in use. Another problem is that in the West, we don't seem to know where to stop. On a few occasions in grade school, I got into some physical fights. The results of these fights were neither crippling injuries, nor were they the start of some new cycle of revenge violence. We scrapped it out and went on to continue our soccer match or basketball game or whatever else we were engaged in. Some, but not all of these combat partners became good friends of mine in later school years. Did I get out lucky? Perhaps. There are plenty of places in the West where young children bring knives and other weapons to school, and fisticuffs can turn into a stabbing match in no time at all. But we've lost something. Modern Western schools are so conflict-averse that in many places the game tag is against the rules. Dodgeball? Forget about it. Children have been dragged into the principal's office for the offense of forming a make-believe gun with their thumb and forefinger. In fact, I've chosen to prime my children for secrecy at school with respect to our own family's hobbies of combat sports and marksmanship. There are some societies which, while thoroughly modern, still maintain honor culture elements, and Japan is one example that I think gets schoolyard fights correctly. When young children engage in physical play that gets too rough, or escalate a verbal argument into a shoving match, the teachers do not intervene unless one of the children is in danger of being maimed. Instead, slightly older students are encouraged to practice their de-escalation skills on their younger chums. No incident reports, no phoning the parents, no blemishing these children's permanent records, and no being dragged into the principal's office. In addition to producing generations of people who are capable of de-escalating a conflict, this method also allows the children to release the pressure of their little arguments, rather than swallowing it and having it explode in their teens and adulthoods as antisocial behavior. Astoundingly, this penchant for laissez-faire conflict resolution does not seem to have been formulated deliberately by way of policy, but is an organic outgrowth of the Japanese culture's modern take on their classical honor culture. While I believe this method of conflict resolution bears some resemblance to how things used to be in the West, where once upon a time children were encouraged to sort themselves out, I fear that implementing these practices, whether organically or by way of a policy, is out of reach of Western societies. We are too culturally diverse, too terrified of litigation, and too not willing to put in the work of learning to solve these problems. Instead, we put them off for a decade or so to when the kids are out of our hair, and the negative downstream consequences can be foisted upon society in general. So, with respect to conflict resolution, what is an honor-minded, modern Western man to do? What do I teach my children, particularly my son, about honorable conflict resolution? The teachers at the schools are happy to turn every youngster into a snitch, but when they socialize, they're happy to listen to music that proclaims that snitches get stitches. I'm as certain as I can be that they don't have the answer. So I teach my son to have a somewhat martial disposition, train him in a few martial skills, But most importantly, I try to impress upon him that other people have their own things going on, their own motivations, priorities, and concerns. I teach him to accept people as they are, where they are, and that different people require different species of persuasion, and some people's minds are outside the bounds of any peaceful means of persuasion, that these people are best avoided, repulsed if needed, and destroyed as a last resort. In the Gore books, the topic of honor is regularly broached. Tarl, as both the protagonist and narrator, regularly questions the honor of certain of his and others' actions, and the Priest King's imposed artificial technological ceiling appears to be purpose-built not only to cultivate a certain aesthetic way of life, but to facilitate, quote, honorable resolutions to conflicts, both internal and interpersonal. When Tarl undertakes actions he deems to be more towards the dishonorable end of the sliding scale, he frequently expresses hesitation, regret, trepidation, or outright refusal, sometimes all of them in succession. Consider one of his asides on the topic of stealth and weaponry. During a single-handed raid of his on a boat in shallow water, he makes use of a bow and kills several foes at a distance, all the while commenting to himself that such actions are somehow lesser than the up-close and personal process of cutting someone down. Of course, this physical manifestation of honor provides us with a problem if we consider the logical progression away from deception and towards direct engagement in combat. Do the feints and parries of swordplay reflect a dishonorably indirect mode of combat? How about the bobbing and weaving in martial arts? In the classical era, including the ancient Olympic Games, boxing matches which had gone on too long were decided via a climax. The fighters alternated giving and receiving undefended blows. A similar style of boxing was depicted in the Canadian Inuit film Atanarjuat, which takes place in the pre-European contact era. In this film, the protagonist and his rival face each other in a series of alternating blows from their hammer fists. They are honor-bound not to flinch or resist the impact in any way, and the loser is the first person to fall. The winner acquired the right to take the woman they both fancied as his wife. Is this the most honorable form of combat, free of head fakes? Since honor in combat seems to be, like the head of a deft pugilist, a moving target, and highly contextual, perhaps the only way to determine if a combatant is honorable is looking at what he is fighting for. It's a strange criteria. In past earthly conflicts, such as the Second World War, one particular honor culture treated enemy prisoners of war with absolute contempt, and thought very little of abusing them and beheading them in what seemed like a whimsical manner, while the Allied side, which was rapidly losing its honor culture, treated prisoners of war, for the most part, in accordance with international conventions, dealt with the same with such matters. Which side was fighting with honor in this case? Before we get too flushed with enthusiasm for Japan's honor culture at the time, do remember that nearly every aspect of that magnificent and martial society was underpinned with a capricious sort of violence that would make Caligula spit out his wine. As to the Allies' forbearance and magnanimity, let's not forget they dropped a couple of nukes on cities. How about honorable war in the modern era? I've heard a lot of people make a lot of noises about how awful the internment situation was and is in Guantanamo Bay, or the abuses that took place in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. But as a matter of comparison, I think it's worth looking at the treatment meted out to infidels when they are involuntary guests of the Taliban, ISIS, or even any recognized Middle Eastern state whose bad side they get on. Also, before the American occupation, it's worth noting that Abu Ghraib prison was regularly the site of extrajudicial killings and torture. The Americans' worst day in charge of that place would have been just another Tuesday under the Ancien Régime. Awards with the word honor in the name are given out as acts of courage under fire and other forms of selfless service. The distinction between the Americans and the Iraqi use of Abu Ghraib prison, to me, is that the American public, as soon as it was known, as well as American higher-up military personnel, they knew that it was a bad idea. Nobody congratulated the irresponsible and abusive treatment of these prisoners, whereas the previous regime bragged about what they would do to their enemies. Truly grotesque. Now, in the Gore books, there are a few examples of a long, hard road in which a man may recover his honor. The main protagonist, Taro, in fact, goes through such a process. For several books, after what he regards as his own dishonorable conduct, he no longer feels himself worthy of the name, and goes by Bosque of Portcar. Bosque of Portcar becomes something of a formidable, respectable, and industrious character in his own right. For a while, living as something of a pirate king in Portcar, which is itself a wretched hive of scum and villainy. The word bosque, by the way, is a herd animal, sometimes domesticated as cattle and sometimes hunted as prey. Bosque meat is something of a Gorean analog to beef, though I pray that in 1,000 years bosque meat yet be unavailable on Gore in the form of a Happy Meal. The changing one's name to that of a lowly beast, shaving one's head, scarring oneself, all of these messages of expiation of shame are found on Earth as well. At the moment, I'm reading a piece of young adult samurai fiction to my son, where the protagonist, though of noble birth, loses the right to his own name and is for some time referred to as Taro the dog. Unfortunately, if one can inherit nobility, pride, and station through no feat of theirs, so too can someone inherit shame through no fault of their own. In some cases, the outward symbols and performances of shame may themselves become utterly grotesque. My Ichiban Dore-chan tells me of girls in Japan with shaved heads, sobbing and bowing in shame in televised apologies. Did this girl let perish a toddler she was babysitting? Did she kill someone while texting and driving? No. She was a member of a J-pop girl group, was contractually obligated to project an image of wholesome virginal innocence on and off stage, and her crime was that she had a boyfriend. Let he who has not sinned cast the first stone indeed. Now, honor is a touchy thing. On the whole, I'd like to think I've lived the first 4 decades of an honorable life, yet I've done some things which have undermined my own integrity. I've done things that have made it difficult for even my Ichiban Dore-chan, which is a Japanese way of saying my #1 slave girl, to continue to look up to me as she loves to do. My fellow fellows, if you ever find yourself in such a spot, where the woman who looked up to you with ease now does so with difficulty, on account of you having compromised your values in some way, it may seem like all is lost, that you'll never have her look at you the same way again. This is especially the case if strong emotions are involved. If you can weather such a storm and come back and fix yourself, overcome and rebuild the trust that she once had in you, her respect for you will actually increase. For not only will you once again be the man she loved, but you'll also be the man who was able to come back from the brink, or pull her back from the brink. You'll be her true master. Is it true that women don't care much for our struggles? It's true they hang around at the finish line and pick the winner. It's also true that they like to run their fingers along our scars. With respect to honor and relationships, in the Gorean novels and in Gore-adjacent fiction, there is a sort of man-out-of-place trope. The Earthman, Taro, while he takes to the Gorean ways like a fish to water, there is one side of things that he tries to do a little differently than the Gorean norm. Though it is his right to take and use wonderful female creatures of any sort and number he desires, he generally takes one into his heart. And though he wouldn't compromise his ownership of her, nor accept anything less than full submission from her, he will treat her with a tenderness that she is grateful for. On Earth, it's the other way around. A man of a Gorean disposition has a different problem. Keeping your woman apart from the rough edges of the world, Cherishing her, protecting her, and loving her are the expected norms. But she also wants and needs to feel your firm hand, the leash tugging at her collar, your absolute ownership of her. And occasionally her back or butt will be begging for the lash. Don't lengthen her leash when she seems withdrawn. If anything, shorten it. Walk that line of showing her your tender earthman side without compromising your ownership of her. Even when she's emotional, don't let her get away with things she'll wish she hadn't done. My slave girl has been going through a very difficult emotional time these past few months that I am somewhat the author of. Anytime things look like they're getting out of hand and I need to physically restrain her, even if she doesn't thank me right then and there, she thanks me later or the next morning. I hope that whatever sort of honor you respect, I hope that you hold fast to it. Its codes are not there for the easy times. If you happen to falter, know that the journey of redemption is going to be about 100 times longer than the compromise was. I think it's worth it, and I hope you do too. I think it's a much better choice than seppuku. Are honor cultures better? I don't know. I admire a reverence for tradition and wisdom, though I'm not so fond of revering the inheritors or even the custodians of either. Thanks so much for listening. It's great to be back in the studio after the summer. Fall has, in fact, always been my favorite season. I like that the spy satellites can't count how many pull-ups I do each morning on account of the clouds. And I don't mind the complimentary cold showers each morning. In case you'd like to know, I live on the west coast of North America, in a place where it rains on days which end in Y. I look forward to continuing this journey with all of you throughout the fall, winter, and next spring. Dads, don't let up. Hold on loosely, but don't let her slip. Lasses, keep the tea flowing. For now the robots seem to be able to vacuum. Someday they'll fold the laundry. Even when they can make the bed, I'll settle for nothing less than tea that was lovingly prepared by graceful fingers. In a future episode, I'll be taking a much closer look at something called the Tao, that's D-A-O, of Gore. Though it may sound like a piece of Eastern philosophy, in this case, Tao is an acronym and it stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. It's something of a thought experiment on how blockchain may allow for alternative polities to municipalities, provinces, and nation-states, and how one or more of these polities may have a Gorean flavor to its laws and regulations. But please join me next week, where I'll be taking a deep dive in Gorean health and medicine as depicted in the Gore novels, Gorean attitudes towards medicine and medical intervention, and other topics related to health, from the most basic heuristics to the cutting edge of bro science. Until then, fair winds and happy trails.